All right, here we go. The people paradox. This topic has made my brain hurt all week, and so I'm excited to just dive into this, and then for us to just to crowdsource better wisdom together on such an important topic. So here we go. A paradox, as I described as we opened this series a couple of weeks ago, is the existence of two competing tensions, both of which are true. The existence of two competing tensions, both of which are true. And this, I would suggest that this tension between understanding and being understood may be one of the most important paradoxes of our life. I think it's this foundation upon which so much in our lives in general and our organizational lives is built that we don't often talk about. So let me start with this question. What would change if you spent just as much time understanding others as you spent trying to be understood? What would change if you spent just as much time understanding others as you spent trying to be understood? I'm not smart enough to suggest, nor do I have the data to support the possibility that our generation is any more selfish than any other, but it sure seems like that's what's being encouraged. If nothing else, we find ourselves in the midst of two influencing narratives regarding who we're supposed to be. On one side, we're told to be ourselves. This is a very strong cultural narrative, to openly express everything we feel, and that it's perfectly appropriate to make it all about us. In fact, as a leader dear to me recently posted, saying how you feel will never ruin a real connection. Now, we could have another conversation about that, but I think it actually could. And I think we would begs the question of what is a real connection? What does ruin mean? But I think sometimes, saying how we feel, even in very close relationships, it can change and even sometimes ruin or stall those relationships for a while. On the other side, so that's one side, is that narrative saying, let's be ourselves. On the other side, we are being told to be full of compassion, empathy, and willing to listen to the feelings of others. Neither of those aspirations are a lie, but I think on their own miss the reality of what it means to live in what I'll describe as right relationship with one another. Expressing ourselves and hearing others presents us with the most fundamental dynamic of relationships. Whether you are a manager, a spouse, a parent, an employee, a president, or a pauper, being the best version of you and me being me requires a little work at navigating the tension between being known and understood and knowing and understanding others. At the very least, I would suggest it involves an awareness of at least three things. Like this is basically the three framing moments of what I want to just describe and set up as we have this conversation. Number one, an understanding that it's complex, that this whole dynamic is complex. We can try to oversimplify it, but the reality is there's a lot going on here, which I'll try to just give us a little framing to start. The second thing is that it requires intention to be right with ourselves and right with others. Intention, and I'll describe what I mean by that in just a moment, and will likely require sacrifices along the way to do it well. That's probably the hardest hitting moment for me this week as I was thinking about this conversation, is it will require sacrifices. I want to read to you real quickly. I wrote a book that was published in 2008 called Dying to Lead. And I was immediately drawn to this one chapter that I wrote called Givers and Takers. Yeah, that's the title of the chapter, Givers and Takers. So I want to, and I did, it's funny when you read yourself, you read something you wrote 13 years ago and you think, there's maybe some other things I would have said then too. But let me just read a couple of paragraphs here. It says this. Sometimes when I read what I wrote, I feel like someone else wrote it. So here we go. Takers are people who have no problem making everything about them. They ask for help when they don't need it. They feel entitled to take because they are just too busy to give back, at least right now. They feel they need to feel in control, smart, and served by others. They feel little guilt about their taking because they are just so overwhelmed by life and what life owes them that they are due their share. Oh boy. They control the outcomes because ultimately they want their own needs to be served. Takers may serve in significant leadership roles in organizations built largely of givers, but the leaders themselves may be takers from those in their own organization. Takers are often control freaks who feel a need to, I wasn't really holding back, okay? Takers are often control freaks who feel a need to control everything in spite of the fact that their inability to let go is making life miserable for everyone else. Givers are another story. You know givers. My mother-in-law is a giver. When she asks you a question, she isn't looking for the answer. She wants to hear. When she offers help, it is out of a sincere desire to help. When she plays with her grandkids, she is interested in giving them something, not making them be or become something that will make her feel better. She just gives. Givers have little need to make life about them. They ask you questions and really want to hear your answers. Givers are interested in you, often at the expense of their own time and resources. Givers often don't think of themselves as givers because if they did, they would be takers. That's the irony. Here's what the next paragraph kind of says this, but if I were to write this today, I would say this. Because I kind of blame takers right here. And I think it is really dangerous to not realize that we all have a capacity to take. Like that, if that fundamentally would miss the wild story of this whole conversation if I didn't say that. Because I'm pointing the finger, but the reality is every person whose face I see has the capacity to take more often than they might give. And I think all of us may have that. That would be my fundamental thing, but that's something else we could talk about for another day. So let's keep going. What does all this have to do with leadership and organizations, and whole leader development? Likely everything. The leading under pressure, it's an inventory that I created years ago. This content of leading under pressure and all that's around it has become so important in this last season. We've probably done 50 sessions with organizations specifically on leading under pressure. And this is why we've done that content, and it's relevant to this, because what it's really about is that under pressure that we have defaults, or we have these tendencies to go one way or the other, that it's all about how do I maintain my convictions? How do I maintain who I am while also staying connected to who you are? How do I express my convictions and what's important to me and also hear yours? That is fundamentally what the Leading Under Pressure inventory is a part of the whole intentional leader development toolkit is about. And it really is the fundamental sort of block upon which so much else that we do is built on. And we studied the strategies that allow people to do both of those things. But when it comes to organizations, this is happening in every part of our life. And sometimes we separate, our business life's different. Well, the fact is that these are human dynamic relationships. And so some of those dynamics are quite literally the same. They may look different because of the context. So let me dive into those three things I mentioned. The first one is complexity. Living in a relationship to others is not only complex because it takes, listen to this. I think what it does, it takes a one-way street and turns it into a two-way street. But because that street has so many on-ramps and off-ramps with all kinds of different drivers showing, think about that. It doesn't just, this concept of complexity in human relationships of me relating to you isn't complex simply just because it's now it's not me going my way. It's now we're driving both ways, but it's because of the on-ramps and the off-ramps and all the different ways that people interact who are jumping on the freeway with us. Showing up well in our world as human beings has so much more going on than simply speaking our truth and hearing the truth of others. If it were that simple, wouldn't life be so much easier? If this was a simple airport book that just said, here's how to be you, it'd be a lot easier, but it just doesn't work that way. Because if it was that simple, I think we would also, even though it makes it harder, we lose a lot of the beautiful complexity of what it means to be human in dynamic relations. I was recently asked to come to an organization and give a keynote on storytelling. This is a true story. I was asked to come, and when I heard that, I don't teach people how to do storytelling. Other people could do a better job of that. I'm still working on my own capacity to do that well. But while I should have said this, this was a paid gig to come speak in front of an awesome group of people. I should have said, sure, I'll come do that. Here's what I said instead. I remember exactly where I was driving when I was having this conversation. I said, I couldn't help but ask if they would be okay if I not only focused on storytelling, but also on story listening. While I completely understand that it would be really helpful for many of us as leaders, if we were better at telling engaging stories, I couldn't escape the reality that most of the leaders with whom I interact do a lot of talking and could use a more whole conversation on what it would mean to draw out the stories of others, and not just simply tell their own. It's interesting because, as you can imagine, I didn't get the job. They didn't, they weren't interested in that conversation. But as if storytelling and story hearing aren't hard enough, there's more going on in our capacity to be understood or to understand than simply listening and talking. For some of us, so think about this for just a second. For some of us, our feelings of not being interesting are a direct deterrent to others hearing from us. Sometimes our feelings, this is like, we don't shy away from the whole story here on Wild Fridays. You all know that, right? Like, we're going to get into some of the complexity without oversimplifying it, but try to bring it to the ground. Sometimes our feelings of not being valued or interesting to others, or our feelings of even being included or not, cause them to be hesitant to draw us out. I know this is true in my own, sometimes I project something in my own feelings of not being interesting. Some of you might think like, oh, Rob must be great at, like, easy to talk to at a party. Like, I am the most awkward person one-on-one. It's unbelievable sometimes how that can feel because of my feelings about myself that can come out there. But for some of us also, I would say that our insecurities about our value default us to never shutting up long enough for others to be heard. You know what I mean? Like, it's just interesting. Sometimes that feeling actually causes us to sort of take the whole stage. The fundamental thing is that living in right relationships with one another involves our capacity to do this well, and also living up to the reality that we don't. We're not going to tackle all this today, but there is some deep brokenness within us. And we've seen this across leaders in our sphere. If there's one thing that we as a Wild Leaders team have had a front row seat to, it's the beauty and the brokenness among leaders in this season. The reality is that we've wronged people, we've screwed this up, we have a lack of role models, and we fail to role model it ourselves to others. But I think that first step is an awareness that this is a complex thing we're talking about. There's a complex thing that's happening within us. Just as a quick sidebar, I couldn't help. I recently had a conversation with my two sons. They're 17 and 19. And that people sometimes pay Wild Leaders for me to come and speak to their leaders. So I was telling them this, and they're like, "Oh, they were like, oh, that's interesting." And then they asked me like, well, "What's the range of speaking fees?" And so I was trying to explain that. And and when I told them that, my younger son looked at me and he goes, "Wow, I'd pay you that much to stop talking." So anyway, I think it's important that our children kind of keep us humble. But here, back to my point. That's just a sidebar. Is like living in right relationship is necessarily complex. And let's talk now about my second point, is regarding intent, right? Relationships with intent. And it is interesting. I want to just do one shout out to some of the research on what people have said was valuable about development conversations that they listed as important and valuable for them. And some of it surprised me when I read it. For people to value our investment in them, and specifically conversations, listen to this. They don't have to be long conversations. I mean, just imagine that for just a second. Like, it doesn't have to be, we experience, like, we think valuable investment in other people and conversations that are valuable have to be long and drawn out, and they don't. They sometimes are deeper relationships, but sometimes they're not, because the second thing that some of the research suggests is that people don't actually have to know each other that well for them to get value out of a conversation. Like, you can say something in a hallway, just having the guts to say something that you've seen in a person that could change the trajectory of their life. I've seen it happen over and over again, but the research would suggest that sometimes it's true. I think knowing people well, I'm not dismissing that, but that sometimes, and here's the last part was that it has to be honest. People want it to be honest. So they don't want fluff. But here's what's also interesting. They kind of need to know that we care. That's my paraphrase on the research. And so what's interesting is sometimes we don't. Like, sometimes, and I think that's what I want to talk about related to interest and understanding. I think this is where my brain went this last week, as I was thinking about the concept of being interesting, showing interest, understanding, and being understood. Okay. And I think it's interesting I say that right now, to think about the concept of interest and understanding. So here's the definition of interest. is that it's a feeling that accompanies or causes special attention to something or someone. Another way is it's something or someone that arouses such attention. And so something about it causes us to feel that sense of motivation to pay attention. It's also a quality in a thing or a person arousing interest. Okay, so that's fascinating to me, because I also think it is interesting that the word interest has the same start as the word intent. Intentionality, like to intentionally pay attention to someone else. But the dynamic is that sometimes we aren't interested. And I don't think we always should blame ourselves for that, but we got to think about, what does that mean? So here's what I wrote down, is that interest implies intent. Like interest, we get, it's also interesting to think about interest on a loan, which basically is paying for the use of money. So this concept of maybe like paying attention. I'm not interested in everything or everyone all the time. And I hope that we would be lying to ourselves. I hope I'm not the only one. I'm just not interested in everyone and everything all the time. Certain things are more naturally draw my attention because of who I am and how I'm wired, and some of the things maybe that have sparked my interest in the past. But I think it is interesting. If we want someone to pay attention to us, a specific person, it's kind of easier to think about that. We'd have to somehow pay attention to what they pay attention to. I don't think we should all feel like we have to be interested all the time in everyone, but there's a dynamic going on. You know what I mean? Some people are drawn into long stories. I struggle with them. You know, it's like some people pay attention to certain things and others, and just being honest about that. Being interested is in a dynamic relationship to understanding, I think, though, also, because it takes an increased level of honesty to actually get to, like, to say, it's difficult for me to pay attention to this because I'm not interested in that way of having a conversation or that part, but I want to understand. And so if we could figure that out together, and the examples in marriage are unbelievable. Do you know what I'm saying? We you can argue with about this, but we love these people. We have chosen to love these people. We choose it every day. They choose to love us every day. And still, you know, even over the long haul, we sometimes struggle. It's like, my wife might look at me and say, like, you don't look like you're interested in what I'm saying right now. Like, how do we have that kind of conversation where I'm like, I am a gross person, because she might be right in this moment, or she might feel the same way in those conversations. So I think it is very, an intentionality and paying attention and honesty in these conversations is where we kind of have to start to increase understanding, if we're to be honest. I don't know. That's a lot to unpack, but I want to get to my third point. Is that it's regarding sacrifice. Without an understanding of our relational defaults, we simply do that. We default. And to default is to do nothing. So default would be to do what's most uncomfortable for us. It would either be to express conviction, or it would be to actually make it all about what's important to other people, and not expressing conviction, what I think is also not fair to us or to them. But for leaders of others, or for just us as human beings, that default will likely either to be overly convicted, too much of me being expressed, or overly connected, too much attention to what you think, need, and feel for me to express myself. And to do something other than a default, in other words, like when you default on a loan, you do nothing. You don't pay, right? So a default is to do nothing. It's just to go with whatever our habits are, whatever those habitual tendencies are. To do something other than that will likely require a sacrifice. I think it's hard to skip around that. It requires a sacrifice, sometimes small and maybe sometimes large. It's one of the realities we can't avoid. The necessity for a possible sacrifice to understand or to be understood. And connecting with others may require a sacrificial behavior or a sacrifice of our will to either make time, to take the pressure off the outcomes, to change our perceptions of ourselves that we hold sacred, like even our perception of ourselves that we are not valuable. That could be the thing you have to sacrifice, because it could be getting in the way of someone actually feeling like it's okay to draw you out, and to put the relationship and the other before us. I think is a really interesting thing. So someone who is here, I'm going to call him out. It's a dear friend of mine, Matt Wool. And Matt was the COO for WiLD Leaders for a season, and just amazing friend of mine. I can't say enough about Matt, but I heard him. And by the way, if you're experiencing amazing things, imagine a person being on the WiLD conversation today who set the original foundation for things that are being built on today. Like, that's who Matt is. So a quick shout out to Matt would be amazing. But to say this, that he said this, I heard him speak this last week. And he described this about, there is so much we try to control that impacts our capacity to live in right relationship with others. And as he talked about this season over the last year, he said, listen to this. Listen to Matt's comment. I just like, this is gold, man. He said, we aren't grieving the loss of control, but the illusion of control we never really had. Think about that. He went on to say that the only thing, now this is a whole other conversation, but it's related. He went on to say that the only thing we really have control over is our capacity to surrender. And I would add to that our capacity to maybe sacrifice. I'm not saying that's the only thing we have control. I think there's nuance in that. I get that, but it's powerful. It's interesting to think about. A consideration of sacrifice is necessary because it is both the right and radical thing to do. And because it models a courage that is so rare and even sometimes dangerous and reckless in our organizations. And I will prove it in a small way. We have a tool called the People Investment Plan. That's a part of the WiLD Toolkit. That is, I felt like I had no business developing a whole leader process without an intentional moment where you take everything you're learning about yourself and you turn it out toward others. And so this tool, the People Investment Plan, it's one tool in the toolkit, but it's this moment where to help us to see others more effectively. And this is some of the conversations it brings up between people who work with each other that is not normal, and it is radically different, and it is so important. Like, this is just some of the questions it has you respond to think about related to people in whom you're invested with, that you work with. Just a couple, let me just give you a couple of examples. What does this person need from me? Why is that a sacrificial question? Because of the reality that every time I answer that for one of the people on my team, I am faced with the dilemma, what if I can't provide what they need? And the sacrifice is to open the conversation that is awkward and clunky, but absolutely necessary if we're going to be honest. And we're going to see people. Here's another one. What do I appreciate about their character? It asked me that. What are their greatest skills and competencies? What, if it were further developed or overcome, would strengthen this person? Listen to this question. We have leaders talk, just people in organizations having this conversation. What matters most to them? And so often I think to myself, I'm not sure I know, but if I paid attention to the little things I've heard, I think this is what matters. And so when I say there's a sacrifice, sometimes there's a sacrifice of my feelings that it's not appropriate to have that conversation inside my organization to see people more effectively. And the PIP, the People Investment Plan, is designed in a safe way to have that, to begin that conversation. But this is why we created this intentional way for people to have that conversation that does require these little sacrifices along the way. I want to finish with one other thought. So those are my three pieces: the complexity, the intent to live in right relationship, and then finally also this possible sacrifice for each of us to consider. And one more. This is one more quote from Matt. Matt said this, and this just blew my brain. He said, "We don't have complete control over everything, and we never did." And I think when we think about relationships as well, there's so much we try to control in people's narrative about us, and even about their own narrative, that if we let go a little bit, that it might open up a more honest conversation. And I would go on to suggest that it starts with seeing that complexity and being intentional about living in right relationships and considering the necessary sacrifices and surrenders that might be necessary in terms of control long enough to create something radically different in relationships to others inside of our organization and outside. So I'm excited for the conversation that we'll have today.